Hi, and welcome back. The last two sessions we talked about betrothal in particular. This session I want to get back to some other aspects of covenant, and particularly what that means for us in relating to others who are in covenant also, what that should look like. And I want to start this session by talking about a story, something that happened many years ago. In fact, in the second half of the 19th century, there was a missionary in Africa named David Livingstone, Dr. Livingstone. And, that famous phrase, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, was expressed by a man named Henry Morton Stanley. In 1874, Henry Morton Stanley, who was a journalist, an American journalist, set out on an expedition to find Livingstone. What a story that was going to be in the newspapers. And so he came to the west side of Africa, and he hired all kinds of laborers to carry all of the goods that he would need, and the food and the supplies, in order to go into the jungle and find David Livingstone. Well, one of the things that Stanley had brought with him was a goat. And he would drink the milk of this goat. That was one of the things that kind of sustained him. Well, as he got into the jungle, a little ways into the jungle, I don't know whether it was days or weeks in, but he got very ill and was unable to move any further, and he was in a tent, and he was very sick and unable to move. And a tribal leader approached him and said, "We should enter into a covenant relationship, because I have at my disposal all of the people in the tribes that I know that have expertise in knowing all of the herbal remedies in the jungle here, and we can make you well again. But we need to enter into a covenant relationship for that to take place." Well, Stanley was not familiar with this kind of thing, and so he resisted as long as he could. But eventually he said, "Okay, I will consider it." And the tribal leader said, "Well, one of the things that you do in this blood covenant relationship is that each of you gives something of value to the other." And he said, "The thing that I want from you is that goat. I want the goat so that I can drink the milk from it." What the tribal leader may not have fully appreciated, but certainly Stanley did, was that at this time, Stanley was so ill that the only thing that he could keep down was the milk from that goat. If he entered into this covenant relationship, he would have to surrender that goat to this tribal leader. So he again struggled with this, but eventually he saw that there was no way forward unless he would enter into this covenant relationship. So he agreed. They entered into a blood covenant relationship, and he gave to this tribal leader a goat, his goat, the only goat that he had. And the tribal leader gave to him a beautiful hand-carved wooden staff that had copper windings in the top of it. It was a beautiful thing. But frankly, Stanley was not too impressed with this staff. He had given the only thing that represented him staying alive to this tribal leader, and all he'd gotten in return was a walking staff. Nonetheless, on they went, and the tribal leader sent his experts to come and help Stanley to get better, and they used the herbs that they were familiar with in the jungle, and they nursed him back to health. And finally he got to a place where he was strong enough and able enough to move forward. And so off he went. And off he went with the team of people behind him, and they carried on into the jungle. And they found something curious happened every time that they came into a new territory with new tribal leaders. As soon as they saw him, they would fall down at his feet and treat him like royalty. And they would quickly usher him and his whole team into the village, and they would feed him, they would give him the best, they would sacrifice their animals and have a feast and celebrate and give them the best of everything. Stanley noticed that nothing of their goods were ever touched or stolen, but in fact, more goods were given to them as they traveled. And every time they came to a new territory, this same thing would happen. They would see him and they would fall at his feet and treat him like royalty and treat everyone like royalty. As time went on, Stanley, his curiosity got the better of him, and he asked one of these tribal leaders, "Why are you treating me like this?" And the tribal leader was very honest with him and said, "Well, that staff that is in your hand is why. Because that staff belonged to a tribal leader that we are in covenant with. And because you have that staff in your hand, you must also be in covenant with them. And because you're in covenant with them, we are in covenant together. We have a connection. And so we can't ever hurt you. That's why we won't ever touch your things. That's why we will all give you the best that we possibly can to feed you and to help you on your way. And we won't ever abuse you or take advantage of you, because we have a covenant relationship with the man who had that staff before you. And now, because you have it, you're in covenant with him. And so anything that we do to you is like us doing it to that person." I hope you're catching the significance of this, because this is really important for us. Because as believers, we have a covenant relationship with God. And that covenant relationship is interesting in that Israel also has a covenant relationship with God on the basis of the covenant God made with Abram in Genesis 15, expanded and renamed him Abraham in Genesis 17, and then to his son Isaac, and then to his son Jacob, whom he renamed Israel. And all of the descendants of Israel have a covenant relationship with God based on what took place in Genesis 15. Yes, that was renewed at Mount Sinai with the nation of Israel, with Moses. But Israel has a covenant relationship with God. And we have a covenant relationship with God through Jesus. And so how we treat Israel is how we treat our covenant partner. Who is our covenant partner? Our covenant partner is God. So we have to be very careful. This is why it is written in the scriptures in Numbers. Well, let's go back to Genesis 12, verse 3. I will bless those who bless you. God said to Abram, I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. And then we carry that thought through to Numbers. Remember, in Numbers 22 through 24 is the story of Balak. And Balak was the king of Moab, and Balak was afraid of the Israelites, and so he hired a prophet for profit named Balaam. And he hired Balaam to curse Israel. And we won't get into the whole story, but God encountered Balaam and said, you're not going to curse whom God has not cursed, but you will only speak what I tell you to speak. And so Balak welcomes Balaam, and they go up on the mountain to a place where mountain of Moab, where they can see some of the children of Israel. And he says, okay, and Balaam says, okay, we need to build an altar and make sacrifices to the Lord God, and then I will speak what I'm going to speak. But he doesn't speak a cursing; he speaks a blessing over Israel. And Balak is upset. He's angry at him, but he says, okay, maybe we were just in the wrong place. So they go to another hill and build another altar, do more sacrifices, and once again Balaam speaks a blessing over Israel. Balak is frustrated even more and says, well, maybe we're just in the wrong place again. So he goes a third time to a third hill overlooking the children of Israel. And another altar, a third altar is built. More sacrifices are offered up to the Lord. And Balaam once again proclaims such great blessing over Israel. And I just want you to catch just one thing here in verse 9. He couches, he lies down as a lion, and as a lion, who dares rouse him? Blessed is everyone who blesses you. He's speaking over Israel. Blessed is everyone who blesses you, and cursed is everyone who curses you. Remember, Balaam, for all his flaws, in this instance, is speaking the word of the Lord. And he's saying that whoever blesses Israel will be blessed. Whoever curses Israel will be cursed. This is what God is saying. Why is that? It is because Israel is in covenant with the creator of heaven and earth. And if you curse Israel, you're cursing God. And you know that's going to bring a curse. If you bless Israel, you're blessing God. And you will receive blessing from the Lord as a result. It's because of the covenant relationship that God has with Israel that we have to be very careful. Now go over to Matthew 25. I know I've mentioned this before, but let's just talk about it again. In Matthew 25, we hear the prophecy of the sheep and the goats. Jesus is speaking. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep on his right and the goats on the left. Remember that, all of that, and then we'll just go down to verse 40. The king will answer and say to them, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. What is he saying? Remember, this is the nations being judged, the sheep and the goat nations. And he's saying how you've treated Israel is how you've treated me. That's what Jesus is saying. This is very personal. We have to be very careful how we treat Israel, because Israel is in covenant with God. And whatever we do to Israel, whatever we speak over a Jewish person, we are speaking over God himself. So we must be very careful what we say. There is an extension of that, and that is that Christians are also in covenant relationship with God like us. Whenever we speak something against our brother or our sister, we are speaking against God himself. Because of covenant, we relate to God always and consistently on the basis of covenant. So how we treat each other is also held in the balance based on our covenant relationship, understanding that how we treat anyone who is in the kingdom of God is how we treat Jesus. Jesus makes it clear this is personal to him. So we have to be really careful. We have to be careful how we treat Israel because they are already in a covenant relationship. But we also have to be careful how we treat every other Christian believer on the planet, because they are in covenant with God. And so we bless whom God has blessed, and we will be blessed. But if we curse, we're cursing God. And you know, that's not a good thing to do. Don't do that. Don't be in that situation. This is personal to Jesus, because covenant is this bond. And so Stanley understood in the jungle there that with that pole in his hand, he carried the identity of that tribal leader, and every tribe that was in covenant with that tribal leader respected him because of that symbol of covenant. And so we are in covenant with God the Father through Jesus Christ. Be very careful what we say, what we do, and even what we think about the Jewish people, about the nation of Israel, and about our Christian brothers and sisters. None of us are perfect. God alone is perfect. But we have to be careful what we say and how we act, because we will have to give an account before God for it. So covenant has an impact Not only on understanding our relationship with God, but understanding our relationship with one another. That's it for today.